Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we're doing something a bit special, really custom built for you if you're gearing up for the Computer Science Research Seminar at Cologne.
Yeah, absolutely. We know you've been absorbing a lot of theory, but now it's about, well, building the actual toolkit.
Right, the sort of systematic statistical structure you need to take raw data and turn it into something solid, verifiable claims.
Exactly. So the focus today is drilling down into empirical research, what it is, how you do it, and critically, how you use that data analysis decision tree. Think of it as the roadmap for your practical exercises, maybe when you're working in RStudio or similar tools.
Okay, let's unpack this then, starting right at the beginning. What actually makes research empirical? Because not everything we do with data qualifies, does it?
That's a great starting point. Empirical research, or ER, it's defined by relying on observation, experience, or experimentation. It's fundamentally about gathering evidence from the real world.
So interacting with reality in some way, not just thinking in an armchair.
Precisely. You can't just rely on logic or abstract models alone. You need data you've gathered somehow. And our sources, they really highlight 5 key characteristics, like a checklist almost.
Okay, what are they?
First, it's got to be evidence-based, using actual data. Could be numbers, could be text, could be both.
Real world stuff. Got it.
Second, it has to be systematic. Your data collection, your analysis, it needs structure. It needs to be transparent.
Systematic. What about qualitative research then? Like if I do some open-ended interviews, that can feel less rigid. Is it still empirical?
Oh, definitely still empirical. But that's where systematic becomes crucial. You might not have a rigid script, but you need a clear plan for how you'll analyze that interview data coding methods, maybe checking interpretations with another researcher.
So the system's in the analysis part too, ensuring it's not just
Yeah.
random interpretation.
Exactly.
Because that directly leads to the fourth point. It has to be verifiable. Others need to be able to understand what you did, maybe replicate it, or at least challenge it based on your methods. If it's not systematic, it's not verifiable. Okay, evidence-based, systematic, verifiable. What else? Third one is kind of embedded. It focuses on phenomena that are observable and measurable, directly or indirectly. And the fifth is straightforward. It must be goal-oriented. You're trying to answer specific questions or test hypotheses. Right, so there's a clear process. Question, design the study, collect data, analyze, conclude. That whole structure keeps it empirical.
Perfect summary. And speaking of testing hypotheses, let's maybe introduce that running example we'll use. It'll help make the stats part more concrete. Good idea. Let's imagine a university wants to improve support for applicants. They're testing a new chatbot, call it Chatbot A, against their current method, maybe an online FAQ or Tool B. The question is Chatbot A actually better? That's a classic scenario, very practical. But before we even jump into how we test that, there's a really important distinction, especially in computer science, that we need to make clear.
What's that?
It's the difference between empirical research and what's called design science research, or DSR. You folks in CS often do both.
Okay, DSR. If I'm the one building Chatbot A, is that DSR?
Yes, exactly. DSR is all about creating and evaluating artifacts. That could be algorithms, models, methods, actual software systems like the chatbot.
Things designed to solve a specific problem.
Right. The goal is innovation that's useful and ideally scientifically grounded. You build the thing and you show it works.
And ER, then, is more about understanding things, like explaining why users prefer one tool over another or predicting usage patterns. Precisely. ER aims to explain, predict, or describe what is by observing and analyzing data. So in our example, building the chatbot is DSR. But the process we're about to discuss rigorously testing if Chatbot A is better than Tool B using data. That's the empirical research part.
Spot on. They often go hand in hand. You might do ER to understand the problem before you design the artifact, and you definitely use ER methods to evaluate the artifact you built in DSR.
Okay, that clarifies things. So we're focusing now on the ER evaluation of our chatbot. We need data. How do we get it? The sources mentioned a few ways. Yep, 4 main methods listed. You can observe, maybe track how users navigate the chatbot interface. You can imagine using surveys, interviews, focus groups, ranging from very open talks to structured questionnaires, like asking about their satisfaction with the answers.
Exactly. Third, you can experiment, which is what our benchmark test comparing A and D is. And fourth, you can use existing documents or digital traces, analyzing chat logs, server data, maybe support tickets.
Lots of options. But once we have the raw data, say the success rates from our benchmark test, you said classifying that data is crucial. Why?
Because the type of data you have fundamentally determines what kind of statistical analysis you can legitimately run. It dictates the math.
Okay. So what are the main types we need to worry about? We measure these on our statistical units, right? Which in our case are the benchmark test runs.
Correct. First type. Qualitative, also called nominal. These are just categories. No inherent order. Think gender, type of query, like admission requirements versus fees, error message categories. You can count them, but averaging makes no sense.
Right.
Can't average admission and fees. What's next?
Rank data or ordinal. Now, there is an order, but the steps between ranks might not be equal. Think Likert scales strongly disagree to strongly agree, or maybe ranking chatbots from best to worst. Okay, so a 5 is better than a 4, but the difference between 5 and 4 isn't necessarily the same as between 2 and 1.
Precisely. Which means calculating a mean, an average score on purely ordinal data is, well, mathematically questionable. You have to be careful.
Which brings us to the third type.
Metric quantitative. These are real numbers where the intervals are equal and meaningful. Reaction time in milliseconds, success rate percentage, number of clicks. You can add, subtract, average, all the standard math works.
And this is usually what we prefer for statistical tests, right?
Generally, yes. Metric data allows for the most powerful tests, the parametric ones we'll get to. It lets you calculate all those initial descriptive stats to mean, median, mode, variance, standard deviation.
And visualize things with histograms or box plots to get a first feel for the data.
Exactly. That exploratory look is vital, but it's just the setup. The real meat is the inferential statistics and hypothesis testing.
Okay, let's dive into that with our chatbot A versus tool B example. We've run, say, 100 standard queries, 10 times each for both tools. We have the success rates. That's our metric data. What's the very first step?
Formalize the question into hypotheses. Before you even look at the averages, state your assumptions.
Right. So the null hypothesis, H0, would be, H0 is always the no effect or no difference hypothesis. So here, there is no difference in the average success rate between chatbot A and tool B. Okay. And the alternative hypothesis, H1, that's what we think might be true.
Yeah.
H1 would be chatbot A is better than tool B, or maybe just different from, depending on the question. Our goal now is to see if our data provides enough evidence to reject H0 in favor of H1. This is where the decision tree comes in. We have metric data, success rates. Can we just jump to a t-test to compare the means?
Not so fast. This is probably the single most common mistake I see. There's a critical gatekeeper question. Is the data metric A and D normally distributed? Or alternatively, is your sample size quite large, say N30 per group?
Normality.
Right.
Why is that so important for something like a t-test?
Because the t-test and other parametric tests rely heavily on the mathematical properties of the normal distribution, the bell curve. If your data doesn't follow that shape, if it's heavily skewed or has weird bumps, the assumptions of the test are violated.
And your results could be misleading.
Totally misleading. The p-value it gives you might be completely wrong, so you have to check.
How do we check for normality? Especially if our sample isn't huge. Maybe those 10 runs aren't enough to assume normality.
You use a specific statistical test for it. A common one is the Kolmogorov-Smirnov test, or KS test. There are others too, like Shapiro-Wilk, which is often better for smaller samples.
Okay, the KS test. How does that work? What's its null hypothesis?
This is where it gets a little backwards intuitively.
Fine.
The null hypothesis, H0 for the KS test, is that your data is normally distributed.
So H0 is an IS normal?
Yes. You're testing to see if your data's distribution is significantly different from a normal curve. So if the KS test gives you a p-value greater than 0.05, our usual significance level,
you fail to reject H0, meaning you don't have evidence to say it's not normal, so you treat it as normal enough.
Exactly. A high p-value here is good news if you want to use a parametric test. But if the KS test gives a p-value less than 0.05,
then you reject H0, meaning your data is significantly different from normal.
Correct. And that result forces you down a different path on our decision tree. Ignoring this check, that's how bad conclusions happen. I remember reviewing a paper once where they just didn't check, used a t-test on clearly non-normal data.
Ouch. Invalidated the whole finding.
Pretty much. You have to match the test to the data's actual behavior.
Okay, super important step. Let's say we do pass the normality check for our chatbot data, or we have large samples. What test do we use to compare chatbot A and tool B?
Then you can confidently use the appropriate t-test. Since we have two independent groups, data from tool A isn't inherently linked to data from tool B, we'd use a two-sample t-test.
What if we'd use the exact same 100 queries on both tools? Would that change the test?
Ah, yes. Good point. If the measurements are paired up like that, same query on A, same query on B, then you'd use a paired t-test, which is slightly more powerful because it accounts for the inherent connection between the pairs.
Okay. So we run the t-test, get a p-value. The usual rule applies. P less than 0.005 means reject H0.
Yep. If p.005, you reject the null hypothesis of no difference and conclude that there is a statistically significant difference in success rates, hopefully in favor of chatbot A.
But what if we failed that initial normality check? Our KS test p-value was low, maybe the data was really skewed, or what if we weren't measuring success rate, but maybe that ordinal satisfaction scale? We can't use a t-test then, right?
Absolutely not. If the data is non-normal and the sample isn't huge, or if it's only ordinal, you have to use non-parametric tests.
Why can't we just risk it with the t-test? Is it really that bad?
It can be. Because, like we said, the mean isn't a good representation of central tendency in skewed data. The t-test relies on means and standard deviations that assume normality. Non-parametric tests are designed to work without that assumption.
Okay, so what's the non-parametric equivalent for comparing two independent groups, like our chatbot A versus tool B, if the data was skewed?
The most common one is the Wilcoxon-Rank sum test, which you might also see called the Mann-Whitney-U test. They're essentially the same thing.
And if the data was paired, like the paired t-test situation,
Then you'd use the Wilcoxon-signed rank test. It's the non-parametric version for paired data.
and the key insight here, the reason these work on non-normal or ordinal data is
They don't use the raw data values directly. Instead, they convert the data into ranks from lowest to highest, and then they compare the distribution of those ranks between the groups.
so they sidestep the whole issue of distribution shape and unequal intervals by just looking at the relative order. Clever.
It's very clever and makes them incredibly robust. They might have a little less statistical power than t-tests if the data actually is perfectly normal, but they give you valid results when the parametric assumptions don't hold. Getting this choice right, parametric versus non-parametric, is absolutely fundamental for your seminar work.
Okay, that covers comparing two groups pretty thoroughly.
Yeah.
But research often involves looking for relationships between variables, right? Not just differences.
Definitely. What if we wanted to know if, say, the time taken to answer a query is related to the success rate? Both are metric variables.
How do we analyze that kind of relationship?
We start with correlation analysis. We calculate the correlation coefficient, usually Pearson's-Wallers.
Right, $2. That tells us strength and direction of a linear relationship.
Exactly. It ranges from -1, a perfect downhill linear relationship, through 0, meaning no linear relationship, up to +1, a perfect uphill linear relationship.
And you mentioned that slightly alarming example from the sources involving storks.
Ah, yes, the classic correlation cautionary tale. Someone actually did an analysis comparing the number of stork nesting pairs in different regions with the human birth rates in those same regions.
And what did they find?
They found a correlation coefficient, $3, of about 0.6. That's a moderately strong positive correlation. And the p-value was very low, meaning it was statistically significant. You'd reject the null hypothesis of zero correlation.
So statistically speaking, more storks meant more babies in that data set.
According to the correlation coefficient, yes. Which immediately brings us to the giant flashing neon sign.
Correlation is not causality.
Absolutely. Just because two things move together doesn't mean one causes the other. There's almost certainly a hidden variable. Maybe rural areas have more storks and higher birth rates for totally unrelated socioeconomic reasons.
That's such a critical lesson for any researcher. Statistical significance shows a link, but it doesn't explain why the link exists.
Couldn't say it better. Now, if you want to go beyond just describing the relationship and actually try to predict one metric variable from another, like predicting success rate based on query length, you move to regression analysis.
That's where we try to fit a line, usually a straight line, through the data points.
Yep, finding the best fit, a fine linear function that models how one variable changes with the other. Very useful for prediction. Okay, that covers relationships between metric variables. What about our non-metric, our nominal features? Can we test for relationships there? Like, is there an association between the type of query, nominal, and whether the user was ultimately successful? Nominal. Yes, no. Yes, we can. We can't use correlation for nominal data, but we can use chi-squared tests.
Chi-squared. Okay, there are different types, right? Two main ones we should cover. First is Pearson's chi-squared test of independence. This is exactly for your question. Testing if there's a statistically significant association between two nominal variables. Like, are technical errors more strongly associated with, say, users on mobile versus desktop?
Perfect example. You create a contingency table, a cross-tabulation of the counts, and the chi-squared test tells you if the observed counts are significantly different from what you'd expect if there were no association between the variables. That's H0.
And it gives a p-value, like the other tests.
Yes, and often a measure of the strength of the association, like the contingency coefficient, C. The example in the sources mentioned a C-value around 0.0164, which is tiny, suggesting almost no association in that particular case, even if the p-value showed significance.
Okay, so Pearson's chi-squared for association between two nominal variables. What's the other type?
The chi-squared goodness of fit test. This is different. Here, you have one nominal variable, and you want to see if the observed frequencies of its categories match some expected distribution.
Expected distribution. Like
Right.
what?
The simplest expectation is often equal distribution. For instance, are technical support requests spread evenly across the 5 weekdays, or do more come in on Mondays? A0 would be the frequencies are equal.
Ah, I see. So you compare the actual counts per weekday to the counts you'd expect if they were perfectly evenly distributed.
Exactly. And the test gives you a p-value. The example showed a p-value of 0.4932.
Which is high, greater than 0.05.
Right, so you'd fail to reject H0. You wouldn't have statistical evidence to claim that errors occur more frequently on any particular day of the week in that data. They look evenly distributed, statistically speaking.
Wow, okay. So mastering this whole sequence, defining the research type, ER versus DSR, understanding data types, doing the normality check, then picking the right path on the decision tree. T-test, Wilcoxon, correlation, chi-squared. That's the core skill.
That is the core skill for the analysis part. It's the systematic process that ensures your conclusions are actually supported by the evidence in a scientifically valid way. It's what takes you from just having data to having findings you can confidently present in your seminar.
And it really emphasizes that using tools like RStudio or others is great for doing the calculations, but the strategic thinking, choosing the right test based on the data that's entirely on you, the researcher.
Couldn't agree more. The tool executes the command, but you provide the intelligence behind which command to execute. Nail down that decision process.
So we've covered the journey from defining empirical research to applying the right statistical tools. This framework is essential for turning those practical exercises into rigorous, publishable insights for the CS Research Seminar.
Absolutely. Remember, this decision tree is your guide. Don't just click buttons in the software. Understand why you're choosing that specific test. That understanding is what separates basic analysis from solid research.
We saw how these tests help us reject a null hypothesis, but only with specific evidence, which leads to a final thought. If stats can show a strong, significant correlation between storks and babies, even with a tiny p-value, what hidden assumptions, what potential confounding factors do we always need to be hunting for in our own data, even when the statistics look perfectly clean? Something to definitely keep in mind as you design your next study.